Well, I stand before you a liberated public servant, and I will be talking on many of the same issues of Gary, and we share many of the same ideas. You will find as we talk, and perhaps as you question us, there are different nuances. But this is, I hope you will have heard from Gary's address, a really significant issue. Now, I do apologise. I hate people who come and go from conferences. And when I look at the high quality of the speakers and the range of issues that have been addressed today and will be addressed tomorrow, I am very regretful. I don't like to sort of come in left wing and exit right wing as theatrical illusion, not political illusion. But it is just the pressure on my time. Yesterday, I had to be in Sydney with Gary because I chair the New South Wales Social Investment Advisory Group. And I think we oversight one of the most interesting initiatives in policy, which is the harnessing of private sector social finance to public good. In New South Wales, you will have heard, the goal is to attract private investors to fund early intervention in reducing the rate and the cost of out-of-home care for at-risk children in deeply troubled families, and to reduce the rate and the cost of prisoner recidivism. I know you've had a brief earlier on social benefit bonds. I will just briefly touch on that issue as I talk. And then this morning, it's the first time I've ever been in 2 convention centres in one day, I was in Sydney because, as you've heard, I chair the Aged Care Reform Implementation Council, ACRIC. What a bloody acronym, eh? Doesn't it? It sounds like a rather painful skin disease that older people get. Anyway, I chair ACRIC and was at the Leading Aged Services Australia conference. And in that address, I talked to the potential transformation of aged care policy, focusing particularly on the value of what is described as CDC, customer-directed care approaches. And this too is one of my keenest interests. I see the possibility that as citizens become used to tailored and individualised and self-managed and self-directed funding, not just in aged care but in disability care and mental illness, then those citizens will become empowered, refusing to accept the often patronising constraints upon their autonomy imposed both by public services and contracted service providers. So, in short, I sometimes feel I'm more engaged with a wider range of public policy issues than I did when I was a public service. And I've got to tell you, it's fun. So, this afternoon I've been asked to speak on the road to genuine partnerships in the third sector. And this too is another matter that captures my passion. Having served on the WA economic audit and in particular contributed to a volume of that audit called Putting the Public First, I then went on to chair the Partnership Forum in Western Australia for 3 years. And that was a little initiative that brought together the key Director Generals and the key CEOs of not-for-profit organisations to negotiate more equitable financial arrangements, to simplify and streamline administration, to co-produce program design. It was an energising experience. I've just stepped down because, of course, it was a little initiative which really was walking the talk of collaboration. I've got a report coming out, I think, later this month for the Victorian government on service sector reform in that state. And there I've worked with community organisations to recommend new ways that they and public service agencies can collaborate in the development as well as the delivery of publicly funded human services. And it's an interest which I also bring to the New South Wales Commission, the Advisory Board. We're going to be bringing out a paper on collaboration, and also to the Queensland Public Service Renewal Board, on which I sit. Now, you'll notice, and you've heard from Gary the reason, that my address is headed Frugal Innovation. And I'd have to say, well, maybe. To be honest, I see it much more as disruptive innovation, and I'm very much on the side of the disruptors. Partnership approaches can reinvigorate the decline in our participatory democracy, can increase trust in the state and its institutions, can change the structures of governance, and can, I think, help us to re-envision and revitalise the central role of public servants. That's what I hope for. And sometimes, when it's a good day, I think we might actually make it happen. And then on Friday, I'm going to be returning up here to Brisbane to speak at a conference honouring that extraordinary scholar of Australian public admin, Patrick Weller. And in that, I'm going to reflect more on the traditions of Westminster, okay, and of Whitehall. In this, I want to do the other side, to talk about what I think are the changes that are necessary. And I know that in starting this conference in the Patterson oration, Glyn Davis was asking whether public organisations are trapped by their past. I don't think that they are. And I'm doing my level best in this forum and elsewhere to try and make sure that they're not. So let me start to wander around a bit, if you don't mind. I haven't got a PowerPoint. I want to tell a story. And looking around in this audience, for some of you, the story may be before your time. But I know for some of you, including Gary, it's a story of which we have been a part. Think back roughly when I went into the public service, which was 25 years ago. And in a way, that's give or take, very roughly, when we really started to talk seriously about some of the issues that Gary's talking about contestability and about outsourcing. In those days, or maybe 5 or 6 years later, because academics need time to catch up, we started to talk about NPM, the new public management. And one element of that was, of course, the willingness to pay others outside the public service to deliver programs and services. Some of you will remember what now seems very ancient and tired language: purchaser and provider, steerer and rower. Most of the time we were on the side of the providers and, worst of all, the rowers. Okay, but it was used as a description about how we would change the nature of delivering government, that we would benchmark our performance and our own cost effectiveness, and then, if there was value for money in it, we would contract others to actually implement government policy. And part of that process was marked, as Gary has noted, by privatisation and corporatisation of government enterprise activities that had traditionally been seen as in the public domain. And he is quite right. Traditionally seen is often wrong. If you go back to colonial Australia, you will see over and over and over again that so much of what we now consider the domain of the public sector was initially provided by the private sector. Whether it's the work of the Benevolent Society, on the one hand providing health services, or, to wear my private sector hat, the work of AMP, which of course emerged in the 1850s as a mutual providing funeral benefits and life insurance. That was an era 25 years ago, 20 years ago, which was marked with those areas in public infrastructure which was often labelled in one form or another PPPs, public-private partnerships. But the bit that I'm interested in here is the development and the delivery of human services, family services, community services, disability services, employment services, Aboriginal affairs, where the contracting was predominantly, but by no means exclusively, out to the not-for-profit sector. Now, I, of course, had a particular responsibility for the early days of the Job Network, now Job Services Australia, had responsibility for that second tender process, at the end of which we had the delivery of employment services, which, remember, for 50 years had been a government monopoly through the Commonwealth Employment Service offices. We had moved to the delivery of services in the employment area, which was, give or take, 50% in the private sector and 50% in the not-for-profit community sector. And so what we have ended up with is that across the range of human services at the state and Commonwealth level, to a very large extent, that is now delivered not by public servants, but by others, predominantly in the community sector. And how big is it? Well, if we look back at the Productivity Commission report, I think it's pretty fair to say that probably this year, about $20 billion of government services is going to be delivered through the not-for-profit sector. This is an amazing transformation. The amazing thing is most Australians don't really get it. They don't see it. It's almost happened beneath the radar. So not-for-profit organisations that traditionally saw themselves perhaps as charities, often as advocacy organisations, are now seen by public services, not often by themselves, but seen as public services as, quote, service providers. This is a profound transformation. 25 years ago, when I did enter the public service, I was in the office, setting up the Office of Multicultural Affairs. We had a lot of grants that went to various ethnic groups. Most of those were grants to subsidise what those community organisations were themselves doing. In other words, government thought that what they were doing was valuable, was in the public interest, and gave them grants to help subsidise what they do. That's not most of the $20 billion this year. Most of that $20 billion is now in the form of contracts to deliver government services. And one of the real problems we have is on both sides of that contractual equation. Public services on the one hand, not-for-profit organisations, third sector on the other, they often have not clearly seen the difference between those two relationships. And too many of the contracts that are being written and being assessed are ambiguous in their nature. So this, I think, was a pretty controversial at the time. I think far less so now. Often critics, usually in academia, would talk about this as the emergence of the contract state or the hollow crown in terms of government. I saw it differently. I was a supporter in the 1990s, and I remain a supporter today. On the whole, if you look at that, and there are hundreds of evaluations done, there is very little doubt that in most cases, providing through the third sector has allowed lower cost, and there, in a sense, is a problem. Because why is it a lower cost? In part, it's because we haven't sorted out the contract for services and the grants. Many community organisations, in effect, cross-subsidise government for the delivery of services. I mean, how bizarre is this that we've ended up? In other words, a community organisation which raises funds for charitable purpose, that often employs people at lower wage rates than public servants, who makes use of volunteers, will often use that subsidy to, in effect, cross-subsidise government. One of the key things that I did in WA was to sit down and work through that. We had PricewaterhouseCoopers come in to have a look. Their estimate was that in WA, and I suspect it wouldn't be different in most states or in the Commonwealth, that in WA, community organisations were probably being underpaid by about 30% of the true cost of the delivery of the services. And to the great credit of the Premier, Colin Barnett, he then addressed that underpayment. So I'm still supporting, but I've got to tell you, in my view, it is a potential revolution that at this stage has only been half fulfilled. Our aim should be, out of this, to provide greater diversity of providers, wider choice for users, more innovation in delivery. And instead, what often happens, there is a recurring bureaucratic impulse to standardise and to control process and to micromanage and to avoid risk. So now I think is the right time to pause and reassess and rethink where we are and where we go from here. So imagine now we've created, in effect, a public economy that's being delivered by all three sectors. See government, if you will, through the public service, commissioning how best to deliver the goals or the outcomes of government through this economy. Let's then articulate this process in terms of providing diversity and choice and flexibility and, yes, entrepreneurship. And this is a key message to you, stop seeing this relationship built over a quarter of a century as transactional. And let's stop and think, how can we do this differently so that it can actually become transformational? Transformational by building collaborative relationships to design how best to maximise public value. So let's stop thinking how to build mind labs and design centres at the periphery of public administration. And instead, let's try and harness the cross-sectoral collaboration that can far better design and deliver services on behalf of government. To me, there are four elements. The first is that we need more, do more, to embrace the experience of the community organisation. Many of them have been in this game a long time. They've got frontline experience. You imagine how it is for many of these organisations. Government decides on policy. It is translated through cabinet into an announcement. It goes to a government department which, through legislation or administration, converts that into services and particular programs, and at that stage, and only at that stage, tenders out the delivery of the policy. How would you feel to be at that end of the chain? How would you be if you knew that if you had been at an earlier stage, almost certainly the programs and services could have been better designed. Second thing I think we need to do is to encourage the entrepreneurship of the enterprise. Okay, things are tough. We're in an austerity environment. Which organisations in Australia live their whole lives in an austerity environment? Don't know from year to year whether they're going to survive. It's the community sector. And that actually drives a significant amount of entrepreneurship and risk-taking. And then when we contract those organisations, too often we constrain that entrepreneurship with the burden of the regulatory controls we impose. Let's also learn from the wisdom of the crowd. And here I'm talking as much about the frontline public servants as I'm talking about those frontline workers working for community organisations. Gary has done some wonderful work, which actually convinces me what in my heart I knew but hadn't articulated very well, which is if you go in the public service at the most junior levels, you will find a remarkable degree of innovation and creativity. And where does it go? It goes into finding workarounds from the administrative guidelines under which they operate in order to be able to deliver the services they need to do. So let's learn from that level. And let's also find ways we can attract social finance from the private sector. You've heard about bonds. Bonds are really interesting. Bonds are only one small part of what is possible with social finance. We can provide capital to allow its social enterprises to start up and scale. Social enterprises, if you don't know, are what many not-for-profit organisations have now become. That is to say, they are trading in various ways, including by delivering government services and using that money, that surplus, to reinvest in their mission. Government can do well to help those social enterprises to grow. We can make social investment financially or more financially attractive. We can enable public servants, as Gary has suggested, to actually break out of the public service and set up mutuals or cooperatives. We can support financial intermediaries to provide money, capital, equity, debt to social enterprises. In other words, what we can do is change the collaborative environment. And what that also means is that we can encourage public sector leaders to themselves become intrapreneurs. In other words, driving change from within. And we know public servants are good at this. If you look at our history over the last 25 years, most of the key reform impulses in public service have actually come from within. So we know we have the capacity to do it. This is an opportunity, I think, to push innovation from the axis of cross-sectoral engagement, so that in the area of human services, the third sector can have a genuine opportunity to contribute to policy, to actively participate in the design of more integrated and holistic wraparound services, can be paid and held publicly accountable on the basis of outcomes, but delivered in their own way without unnecessary interference. And that's going to require a move away from standardised delivery of standardised programs. I just don't get this, do you? Why really would we outsource delivery from the public service to a not-for-profit organisation if you say that the service you're going to be delivering has to be standardised in this way and has to be managed in this way. What's the purpose of doing that? The whole basis, the potential, the transformational potential of outsourcing is in fact to enable different ways of delivering outcomes. It's certainly going to be enhanced by local and place-based solutions. And by that I don't just mean regions that many of us at times construct as public services as for administrative convenience. I'm talking about place-based approaches in terms of communities and neighbourhoods and housing estates and remote townships and Aboriginal settlements and schools and hospitals, where those communities are given more opportunity to make their own decisions, take their own responsibility on how to use government funds. And it's going to be enhanced too by putting citizens in control of the services they need to live a full life, giving them the opportunity to manage their own budgets, to select their own services, to choose their own providers. This is not going to diminish the responsibility or the status of the public service. What it does, I think, require is for the role to be redefined. So you see, to me, the public service leaders of the future are above all going to be facilitators. They've got to be the people who are empathic listeners. They've got to be the skilled negotiators. They've got to be the team-based designers. They've got to be the effective coordinators. In other words, they are crucial as partners in the delivery of a more networked form of governance. They are, if you will, going to be the system stewards, bringing the diverse actors together in human services, the private sector to some extent, but predominantly the community sector, bringing those actors together with the public service for governance on behalf of society as a whole. And the good news is it can be done. The future is already with us. It's just not evenly distributed yet. Look at any of your jurisdictions and you will know when we're talking about customer-directed care or local-based solutions or collaborating with the third sector, we've got examples of it happening. What hasn't happened, and what I think has got to happen, is that those pilots and demonstrations and trials actually become at the centre of mainstream public administration. Thanks.
Peter mentioned in relation to the cost provisions of some of the social work, if the state pays the third sector 30% lower, then maybe they can deliver it lower. I'm being a bit flippant there, but also we know situations where in the housing sector, community housing can be provided much cheaper than state housing because Commonwealth payments will be made to the community housing sector, not to the state. So that can occur. In relation to the commercial side of things, the yellow pages type things, why is it that the private sector is able to do things at a lower cost, do you think, than government, apart from wages and other incentives?
Well, wages are not unimportant. It's 60-70% of public service. I mean, public service sector is a human services industry, and so 60-70% of costs are human related. And so the cost structures are frequently very high. I mean, they're just simply skewed. Some places they're way too low, and other places they are simply too high. Some of that has to do with the way we... one of my favourite... I did a lot of work on the prison sector in the UK, which were all... The contract prisons there were all greenfield, up until quite recently. They were all newly built. And they were paid significantly. If you looked at how much they were paid, I mean, there were two differences. About 50% of it was they just simply used fewer people. They used more technology and smarter ways of engaging the prisoners in cooking and managing themselves in order to reduce staff costs. The other part of it was unit costs, which sort of looks like really bad news until you look at the work profile. Basically, the public sector prisons were males 50 years plus who were at the end of their career and at the top of their band. The privately managed prisons tended to be young people in their 30s who had been in a trade and wanted to go into the police force or somewhere else. They were using this as a stepping stone to go somewhere else. A higher turnover, which meant you didn't have everyone at the top of your band. You weren't sort of accumulating long superannuation and leave arrangements. So the profile of the workforce was just quite different. So you just see a lot more experimentation with that sort of thing. And I did a lot of work going through the mostly US literature, but there was some UK, a little bit of Australian literature looking at the differences. What is it that they're doing differently when they take over a contract? And the answer is it wasn't any single pattern. In some cases they would standardise, and other places they would multi-skill. Specialise, and in some other places multi-skill. There was just a whole variety of different things going on. Massive. One of the big differences you see almost always is a lot of experimentation goes on with rostering and trying to optimise the way in which staff are, full-time, part-time staff, optimise the range of skills. Do I specialise here? Do I multi-skill? There's a lot of experimentation goes on with that. It's called management. And what I find, having spent 17 years working closely with a very large public service provider, but from outside, is there is far less of that going on within government than there is within commercial organisations. So there's just, it's called management. There's just a lot more management going on within the private sector generally, but within privately managed public services. They just put a lot more time into optimising that. The example you gave recently about a particular service in New South Wales, which I don't think we're yet free to talk about, but what was different in that case, as you know, it had to do with sick leave and overtime games that were being played in an organisation. I thought what was interesting there, what was going on, was one, you were providing a credible independent benchmark data, and they knew you were going to keep coming back at it. You then had a message that the individual involved decided to be a leader and went and negotiated with the union to say, what's your bottom line? And then he set up a very clever set of internal incentives to get the staff to begin to deal with the rorting problem. But he knew that no one was going to be running off to a minister. The minister was going to back him in that reform agenda. That dynamic is enormously important, and I think a contract, as opposed to outsourcing or as opposed to using the private sector or whatever, a contract provides a lot of that clarity within which the manager can manage.
Peter, I just want to add one thing, because I don't want to leave the impression that the only reason that I think that a community organisation is more cost effective is because to some significant extent they end up cross-subsidising. They also, of course, do have a significantly lower wage structure, even with the recent increases in community award rates. They tend to make very effective use of their staff. And the other thing I want to emphasise is that in terms of cost effectiveness, they are probably the point at which we get serious about integrating services. I used to speak endlessly in the public service about the need for whole of government approaches, joined up government. And I think we've done a pretty good job at doing that at the area of policy development. We're still woeful at doing it in policy delivery. So the reality there is you're sitting with someone who needs social housing or is long-term unemployed, and we know that they need a range of services that come from different jurisdictions, different agencies, different programs. Who does that? It is nearly always the community sector organisation that actually gets serious about whole-of-government approaches, and that's truly the benefit that we get from it.
Peter, just a question. You talked lastly about standardised service delivery, and I just, my understanding of one reason for trying to encourage a degree of standardisation was to also end up with equity across the services, and also a degree of consistency, consistent quality. And I was just wondering how you would balance those.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really very good question. What is it that public services still tend to do best? What they're still best at, I think, is sort of 19th century industrial mass production. In other words, if you look at the delivery of payments, if you look at tax refunds, where you've got millions of transactions, it is processed with extraordinary efficiency most of the time by public sector agencies to a high degree of accuracy. We're surprised when it goes wrong. And one of the things we've always said is, and the great thing about in Australia or in a particular state is where you live, you can always be assured you'll get the same service. And that is the reason for standardisation. And it is true that it's often argued in terms of improving equity. The difficulty is, of course, that it often ends up meaning that you end up with a lowest common denominator service. So we need to address the problems that will come from non-standardisation rather than to retain the standardisation. So that, for obviously, let's take the area of disability where we've made the greatest progress in terms of individualised service delivery. There is a potential that with people with disability, if you're more educated or come from a wealthier family, that you will be more able to make use of the freedoms and the choices you can have in terms of how you want to manage the money is at your disposal. The answer is not to say, well, that's not equitable, and so we should just have this standardised list of services which everybody has to have. What we should say is that then for equity reasons, we need to provide those who are going to be disadvantaged with the support that they need in order to exercise their autonomy. And remember, this isn't just about choice. This is about saying that you take responsibility for the services that you're getting. Okay? It is about seeing that what you're getting is just in part an entitlement, but it comes with obligations, its rights and responsibilities. That, I think, is the liberating part of this, because we know, not just here, but just about every country that has had, in various ways since the Second World War, a welfare state, that we now see the problems that have emerged in terms of second and even third generation welfare dependence. That the trouble with standardised programs and services is, to a very considerable extent, it takes away control from the dependent and the recipient and the beneficiary. And out of it they learn helplessness. Start to have programs and services that are flexible and can be tailored to the community need or an individual need, and you can transform that.
Your comments about redefining the public service and our role in terms of seeing ourselves as enablers and facilitators, and I think you said system stewards, clearly implies us no longer seeing ourselves as program managers, contract managers, policy designers, and that is how we have traditionally organised and structured ourselves. Do you have any comment about, in thinking of ourselves and our role in that new way, what needs to fundamentally change in how we structure ourselves?
So I'm not saying that a public servant no longer provides public policy advice or is not involved in the design of the programs and services that give effect to government policy. What I'm saying is that they share that role. that they work with others from the private and the community sector in that task. And that's why I describe it as facilitation, collaboration. It is just starting to work in a different way. You know, again, when I think back in the 1990s, it was almost impossible to be in any government department and not at various stages be sent on a team building exercise. You know, working as teams, some of you remember. What I'm really talking about here is taking working as teams to a greater level. The public servant is important. The public servant isn't just part of that team in terms of policy advice or design or delivery. They are dead centre. They, if you think about commissioning government, are at the intersection, at the axis. Okay? The difference is that public servants will start to use that role in terms of creating more approaches based on partnership and collaboration in order to achieve better outcomes from what I see as a network form of governance. Go to you.
Peter, do you see the core public sector, not just policy development, but the implementation ones, do you see that shrinking? Do you see hybrids in every sector, or do you see a whole transfer of workload out into a non-government sector?
I think that the default position in human services, the default position is that the service will be delivered outside the public service. Having said that, there are particular areas, particularly like where you have a statutory responsibility for the protection of children, where that may not be possible. But my starting base is, look, we're talking about commissioning government. It's horses for courses. With different programs and different services, we will get different outcomes. What I would actually hope is that we also become much more adept at running not here's a pilot or here's a demonstration project, but we say in this state we're going to run 4 different pilots and 4 different demonstrations, and we're going to try doing it differently and actually compare how they operate. We do that far too infrequently.
Hello, my name is Lucy Alcock. I work with the Department of Conservation in New Zealand. And so we don't work so much in human services as in environmental and conservation services. And we have a very strong mandate to work with communities and to collaborate. And the aim of this is to not replace our work with contracting or competition and so on, but simply to get more communities, more individuals and more businesses doing more conservation work, because it's good for us, good for them, good for their profit, bottom lines, good for the nation as a whole, good for the species and so on. So I was wondering if you had any comments on that sort of environmental perspective, or whether it is more focused on human services.
It's a great question, and I wish you asked me in 3 months. And I say that because in a previous address I gave it about a month ago, there was someone who came from the area of natural resource management who had a very similar statement, saying that what you're talking about as what you need to do in the area of human services is an area, in fact, we're at the cutting edge, and we're doing a great deal of this. And in fact, they're arranging a workshop of people who work in this area of natural resource management, environmental protection, conservation, in actually to put together a paper for me on precisely this issue. And I'm looking forward to receiving it. I think that there is clear evidence that in that area, many of the ways of working collaboratively have probably been further developed than in the area of human services.
What would it take to move the behavioural thinking of our communities into not expecting government deliveries, but to have alternative solutions? Because a lot of what we deliver, people expect us to deliver and have faith in that process.
One of the interesting things that's happened in firefighting is that in the better fire services around the industrialised world, firefighters are really spending very little of their time now fighting fires, because through regulation and the use of alarms and the encouragement of alarms, we've now completely altered the ratio. There are just simply far fewer fires occur now. So there's been a radical shift in that. So in that particular case, interestingly, there's another sort of interesting example, which is an American fire and ambulance company who was one of the pioneers in this, where they were able to produce radically different results because they used planning laws in order to just insist that people had to have better materials and alarms. So the nudge factor in this is one of the ways in which we can begin to alter the mix of service provision and self-provision, because basically putting in and maintaining a fire alarm is about educating people and getting the householder to accept responsibility for the fires that will occur in their home and the extent to which the fire brigade are notified early. So, look, the solutions on this are, this is not just simply, and I hope I made that clear, this is not just simply sort of a rush towards outsourcing. There's a much more complex repertoire of tools we have here that enable us to rethink the way in which we provide public services and to do that. Frugal innovation is the title of the session after all.